HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gamesmaster. My life in the 80s geek culture trenches with G.I. Joe, Dungeons & Dragons, and the Transformers. By Flint Dille. Read by Eric Michael Summerer. A fascinating collision in geek culture history. It was sometime in the spring of 1985. Steve Gerber sat across the table from me in the conference room at the Sunbow office in Westwood. We'd been there long enough to stop noticing the traffic outside. We both smoked cigarettes and had scripts in front of us. Mine still had the perforation stubs on the side because it was printed on my daisy wheel printer. His was Xeroxed. We were working on the central scene of what would become Transformers the movie. Namely, we were trying to figure out how to kill Optimus Prime, mortally wound Megatron, and leave Hot Rod a little bit responsible for the death. Prime, of course, couldn't lose. Megatron had to kill him through treachery. The bones of the scene were there and had been since the beginning. This was all about fitting together the nuances, the details. Steve wasn't really on Transformers, he was on G.I. Joe, but we all helped out in a pinch. He was arguably the best story editor in the business, and animation writing was his second career. He'd already had an epic comic career, creating Howard the Duck and writing God knows how many comics before coming to L.A. and getting into animation. He and Joe Ruby had created Thundar the Barbarian. He didn't have a lot of time. A friend of his from New York who'd just moved to L.A. was coming for lunch. So we were reading the scene, imitating bad actor voices for the characters. I'd sketched the geography of the scene in stick figures because I was the only person in the animation business who couldn't draw, except for maybe Steve. We were laughing, having fun. Neither of us had any idea that the scene we'd been working on would scar a generation of kids, or that 30 years later I'd be doing an interview for the Blu-ray disc edition of Transformers the movie. Hildy Mesnick stepped into the room. "Your lunch meeting is here." "Send him in," Steve said. "Flint should meet him." A minute later, a guy with an ammo bag came walking in. He had long hair, but he didn't seem like a hippie. He was something different, intense, focused. He reminded me of John Lennon. We told him what we were working on, and it turned out he had a problem too. He was working on a Batman graphic novel. I wasn't really sure what a graphic novel was. Unlike Steve or Marty Pasco or Buzz Dixon or Roger Slifer, I wasn't really a comic book guy. I'd read the usual comics when I was a kid and took the DC side of the Marvel vs. DC argument of the late 60s, but I'd stopped reading comics sometime around junior high, and except for occasionally wandering into the comic shop near UC Berkeley, I hadn't thought about comics again until I met these guys. His problem was a fight between Batman and Superman. Didn't seem like much of a problem to me. Unless Batman had some kryptonite, it was game over. It was probably game over even if he did have kryptonite, as Superman could fly really fast and turn back time, or he had freeze breath or heat vision, or could punch Batman all the way to Mars if he wanted to. World's Finest didn't make any sense to me. Batman was smarter, arguably, but sometimes Superman had a super brain too, so even that wasn't certain. They were patient with me, explaining that Superman was more like the Fleischer Superman. I only vaguely knew what that was, or like George Reeves in the TV show, not like Christopher Reeve in the movies. I could sort of see that, though George Reeves versus Adam West still didn't seem like much of a fight. But I just listened. After all, I was writing a scene in which a robotic Walther PPK was fighting a semi-trailer truck, and they were the same size in the scene, so it wasn't like I had the logical high ground. Anyway, we worked out an elaborate scene. Batman had prepped the battlefield. He'd rigged bombs in a building. I didn't think bombs would hurt Superman, but I was told, they'll keep him busy. It was a good enough answer. We moved over to our scene. I said I wanted Optimus's death to feel like Davy Crockett's death in the John Wayne version of The Alamo. I'd seen that movie when I was 5, and it became the centerpiece of my early childhood. Steve's friend hadn't seen The Alamo. Instead, the movie that inspired him the same way when he was a kid was called The 300 Spartans. And by now you've probably figured out that the guy was Frank Miller, and that the Batman comic book he was talking about was the 4th installment of The Dark Knight Returns. I've told this story a lot of times to a lot of people for a wide variety of reasons. Transformers fans love hearing about how Transformers the movie was created. I talk about it in lectures at the USC Film School because that scene is about something a lot bigger than Frank or Steve or I, or even Transformers and Batman. To me, it's about the incredible burst of creativity that happened in the 80s and in other golden, or silver or platinum, ages. Introduction. This is a story about being in the right place at the right time. It was the mid-80s, one of those golden eras in my life that violated probability. A magical period when there are so many coincidences, serendipitous events, and unique and improbable people that the normal rules of life seem to have been suspended. For me, it was having an all-access pass to the geek 80s and working with an amazing collection of people who laid the foundations for what would be popular culture decades later. So yeah, it's a memoir, but it's also about something a lot bigger than I. It will never be 1985 again, but it would sure be great if we could drag some of 1985 into the 2020s. Lord knows we could use the fun. So somewhere in here is a piece about a golden age, and how, hopefully, to inspire another one. While I believe everything in this book is the truth, the reality is that I function more like a fictional character in this book than an actual person. It even feels fictional as I write it down, but everything you'll hear here would pass a polygraph, and most of it has corroborating witnesses. As this is being written as a memoir and delivered in the linear form of a book, it is almost impossible for me not to turn chaotic, random events into a narrative. That is how the brain works, and it's also why memory is tricky. Because we all know that the real world is not linear. It is nonlinear, chaotic, uncoupled and coupled at the same time, and at best all we are working with is a very limited data set. Some of it has been forgotten, some of it is unknowable, and some of it is hidden. That's how life works. We make narratives and tell ourselves stories, literally, to make sense of the world. So, on one level, this book is one big wild adventure. On another level, though, it is about the process of going from being a complete noob to being a seasoned writer headed for the next challenge. It's about learning the tricks of the trade from masters, and then having to use those tricks all alone in front of a blank page. It's about success and failure. I mean really big, embarrassing failure. And then more success and even worse failure. Rinse and repeat. It even ends with simultaneous triumph and disaster. Kipling's old imposters. But they sure feel real when they're happening to you. When asked, we all work out a narrative, an elevator pitch as to how it happened. But that's just a story. It's always more complex than that. And this book is about some of that complexity. It is wins and losses and respawns and power-ups in the great game of life. There's good luck and bad luck. To some extent, it's what you do with the wins and losses. For me, it started with Mr. T, went to droids and Lucasfilm, then to G.I. Joe, Transformers, Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines, Inhumanoids, Agent 13, Visionaries, Sagard, and literally ended in the trash can with Garbage Pail Kids. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, a whole new era began. Interestingly, as I started this book, writing from a Google Doc I'd compiled of various interviews, 3 decades and several eras later, I was creative lead at a company called Niantic Labs, and we were a startup about to release a make-or-break new game called Pokémon Go. The curious thing about this journey is that it more or less follows what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. It's been parsed 100 different ways, and I'll give you one more. But when I refer to it, this is what I'm referencing. The Joseph Campbell heroic template. 1. Heroes are introduced in the ordinary world, where 2. They receive a call to adventure. 3. They are reluctant at first or refuse the call, but 4. Are encouraged by a mentor to 5. Cross the first threshold and enter the special world where 6. They encounter tests, allies, and enemies and find their hidden lair, Sanctus Sanctorum. 7. They approach the inmost cave, belly of the beast, crossing a second threshold. 8. Where they endure an ordeal. 9. They take possession of their reward, and 10. Are pursued on the road back to the ordinary world. 11. They cross a third threshold, experience a resurrection, and are transformed by their experience. 12. They return with the elixir, a boon or treasure to benefit the ordinary world. You can decide whether I ended up a triumphant hero or a pile of bones, but all of the elements are there. And that whole concept is very fitting for this particular material because near the dead center of this story, the real George Lucas handed me a copy of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, along with the uses of enchantment, the meaning and importance of fairy tales by Bruno Bettelheim. There are thresholds and guardians, allies and enemies, temptresses, goddesses, a road of trials, a few inmost caves, and the bellies of a few beasts. The book is really about the elixir, which doesn't exactly come in a bottle so much as in the form of incredible life lessons from the extraordinary people I traveled this road with over 30 years ago. And while this is marketed as my story, it really isn't. I'm more a Zelig, or like Virgil in the Inferno, except we weren't in hell. Far from it. This was a golden age, distant in some ways and present in others. The world isn't much like it was in 1985, but even in 2019, Transformers and superhero movies rule the big screen. Dungeons and Dragons and paper RPGs are having a huge comeback, and, in fact, I'd argue that in many ways, the late teens of the 21st century are getting to look more and more like a reflection of the mid-'80s. As Mick Jagger said when he played the Hollywood Bowl for the first time since 1966, everything has changed except the playlist. So, like any good myth, we'll start in the place where I was living when this whole adventure started, the ordinary world, as Campbell would call it. Hollywood as it was when I got here. Summer 1976 to 1982. My first real exposure to Hollywood came after my junior year at Berkeley, in the summer of 1976. When I drove down to Los Angeles for 6 weeks for the USC Universal Summer Cinema Program. I was heading into my senior year and had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. In high school, I'd figured I was going into the movie business, but when I chose Berkeley over USC, I put that on hold. After all, USC had the best film department, and Berkeley had no film department. Anyway, the USC Universal Summer Cinema Program ended up as something of a bust for me. I got a sinus infection and didn't initially take to LA. I made 2 terrible films, showed no talent, and secured 0 contacts in the industry. In fact, I remember almost nobody from the experience, and none of them resurfaced in my life ever again. That said, it did condition me for what was to come and give me a great base of Hollywood knowledge. What was great about it was that we spent a third of our day in production, a third of our day in criticism classes, and the other third at Universal Studios. It all added up to an almost perfect view of Hollywood as it was, right on the eve of everything changing forever. At Universal Studios, we met with a range of industry characters. Henry Bumstead, the legendary production designer, came and talked to us. Their veteran sound guy, whose name I've forgotten, gave one of the best illustrations of the use of music in films that I've ever seen. He projected a sequence with a guy pulling up to a house in his car. He played suspenseful music, and it seemed like a murder was about to happen. He played floozy music, and we figured the woman was of low repute, and then he played romantic music, and it felt like a romance. I never undervalued soundtrack after that. One executive told us a story about when MCA bought Universal Studios. He was at MCA, and Universal apparently believed it was really a merger. This guy's job was to let the Universal guy know it was a takeover, and so he sent a construction crew over to the office area where the Universal executive was and started jackhammering the steps to his office. Somehow that ended the power struggle. MCA was in charge. I'm butchering that story, but that's the gist. In the end, some bold tactical maneuver answered a deep corporate question. It was also a story about how the world worked in the last of the Wild West days of Hollywood. Don't like your opponent? Bulldoze his office. Today you'd probably be cited for not doing an environmental impact report and run into 50 other problems, but in the old days, boldness paid off. Or maybe it was just a literal example of move fast and break things. Even though the story seems profoundly anus-esque, it was also pretty amusing. I left with the impression that the industry was a whole lot of fun back then if you knew how the game worked and were willing to play. On a lighter note, Edith Head came and talked to us. She didn't have any good demolition stories, but she talked about costuming Doris Day and how that was really all her. I took that as a reference to Doris Day's figure, but wasn't sure. Doris Day was somebody I remembered from my childhood. It seemed like an old reference. It added to that creaky feeling of the movie industry. It didn't seem to be about what was happening right now. Hollywood had gone through one major shift a decade earlier. After Easy Rider, nobody wanted to see an old-style Hollywood movie again. Everything changes after a paradigm shift. As one executive said, every young guy with a beard got to direct. This, of course, meant Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, John Milius, and on and on and on. New people arrive, and the old are garnished. That summer, Universal screened upcoming movies for us. There are few better feelings in the world than sitting in a studio screening room and seeing a movie before it was released. We even saw some before they were final, which really made us feel like Hollywood insiders long before there was a show with that name. There's no way to overstate how cool and special people felt when they got a peek at the fame and glamour of Hollywood in the 70s. Stars and directors had a real mystique back then due to rare public exposure and carefully manicured images. They were larger than life and extremely exotic, only seen at red carpet events or iconic appearances, and, of course, on celluloid. That summer we saw The Hindenburg, Family Plot, Alfred Hitchcock's final film, Car Wash, Midway, and Swashbuckler, among others. Consider that list again. These were the products of an industry that didn't know what to do, or one that perhaps thought movies had hit design exhaustion. I'll leave it to film historians to decide whether The Hindenburg destroyed the disaster film. But despite a big cast and big special effects, the movie tanked. I suspect that slow dirigibles are hard to pull off on film, but that's a different discussion. The point is, if you look at the movie slate from 1976, it's the kind of slate you have when you're waiting for the next big thing to happen. And it would. Star Wars would come out less than a year later. And that's relevant, because you can't understand the 80s without understanding Star Wars. This time it was Alan Ladd Jr. and Fox. It seems they put the last quarter in the slot machine and came up with a jackpot. And just to put a button on Universal, George Lucas had pitched Star Wars to them and they'd rejected it. The legend is that Frank Price told George Lucas to take his robots and split. So that was the Joseph Campbell ordinary world. And even though Star Wars would change everything a year later, the world doesn't morph that fast. Much of the old world would still be hanging around by the time I got to LA to obtain my master's degree in film at USC between 1979 and 1981. Kid dropped in from the 25th century. From an early age, I had a very interesting relationship with the worlds of fantasy and science fiction. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago in a house that looked like a smaller Wayne Manor and a dad who collected antique cars and whose own father was the originator of Buck Rogers. This fact is going to become very relevant to this story from here on out. For those of you who don't know, Buck Rogers began as a comic strip in 1929. It was based on a novella or short story called Armageddon 2419. My grandfather owned a newspaper syndicate called the John F. Dille Company. You'll find those words in the corner of every early Buck Rogers comic strip. We had various Buck Rogers artifacts around the house, ranging from old rocket ships to ray guns to solar maps and stand-ups. My dad still owned the newspaper syndicate, which owned the rights to Buck Rogers, and every now and again people would try to make it into a television show. The extrinsics of my life can pretty much be described in 60s sitcom terms. My father reminded me of Dick Van Dyke in The Dick Van Dyke Show. My mother was more Donna Reed than Laura Petrie. My sister was 7 years older than me. My grandfather reminded me of James Arness in Gunsmoke, and my grandmother was a small jewel of a woman. We were the opposite of a dysfunctional family. Dad had a Lincoln Continental town car that looked like both the Batmobile and the Black Beauty if you caught it from the right angle. He had a Silver Cloud 1 that looked exactly like Amos Burke's Rolls in Burke's Law, and a Bentley R-Type, the same color and model as the one on the front of Delaney and Bonnie's On Tour with Eric Clapton. Dad's office building was in the Civic Opera Building, which looked exactly like the building I imagined Thomas and Martha Wayne visited before they were killed in Crime Alley. We went to a lot of car shows, and thus none of the cars I'd see in James Bond movies or The Great Race were particularly alien to me. But all of this gives a much more lavish and outsized version of my childhood than it should. We were what was known as comfortable. The town I grew up in was called Glenview, and it bore a great similarity to every Riverdale from Archie, with bits and pieces of the Hardy Boys and later Risky Business, along with just about any John Hughes film. It was Chicago. We played baseball in the summer, football in the fall. We threw snowballs in the Siberian winter and could really feel the first day of spring. For what it matters, I was an undersized, dyslexic kid with mixed dominance. Neither side of my brain was dominant, who had to be in a special Gillingham method reading class with Mrs. Kratz at North Shore Country Day School in Winnetka, Illinois. I knew there was something wrong from all the whispers and poorly veiled euphemisms, but I couldn't quite figure out whether I was retarded, like my friend Skipper down the street, or whether it was more of a minor glitch. Other than various learning difficulties, I functioned more or less normally. I was good at games. In fact, the only reason I was able to watch the first generation of Star Trek and Batman in color was that Andy Baldwin, our neighborhood brain, would call me up to play chess, and I'd drag the games out in order to watch the shows. So I figured I wasn't stupid. Not if I could play chess with Andy Baldwin. I planned it so I'd win just over half the time. If he won too much, it'd be boring. If I won too much, it'd be frustrating. It was my first experience in life with play balance. The two most influential movies of my childhood were John Wayne's The Alamo, which I saw when I was almost 5, and Goldfinger, which came out when I was 9. Those two, and films like them, would have a profound impact on the work I did, especially early on. So I had a semi-normal Midwestern childhood. Unlike most of my friends and colleagues from the Sunbow era, there was little about my childhood that suggested I'd spend most of my adult life in sci-fi or fantasy. Leave Buck Rogers out of this for a moment. I read the normal amount of comic books and loved Mad Magazine. Because of my reading problems, my parents would buy me just about anything if they thought I'd read it. When I was in 6th grade, the big fight was over whether Marvel or DC was better. We'd have endless debates about Batman versus Spider-Man, or Aquaman versus Namor, or Thor versus Superman. I was conflicted. I sided in almost all cases with Batman and thought Peter Parker was a wiener, but at the same time I never voluntarily missed an episode of the Spider-Man cartoon, and the DC animated shows seemed lame to me. My favorite animated shows were probably the really early Marvel ones, which almost weren't animated at all. 6th grade was my ultimate year for kid geekdom. Friday night in 1966 might also have been the best night ever for television. It started with The Green Hornet, The Parting Kissers, The Black Beauty, which really looked like it might be able to patrol the slicked backlot streets, The Sting, The Trench Coat. I loved the feel of it. More than anything, I think I loved what the show could have been more than what it really was. Oh, yeah, and The Flight of the Bumblebee. And the drone that came out of the back of the Black Beauty. The cars spinning around in the garage, the buzz of the Hornet sting. It felt like there really could be a superhero, or at least a vigilante, in that world. After the Green Hornet came The Time Tunnel, then The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or The Wild Wild West, then The Cat. After 6th grade, my mother sent me to summer school at the local junior high to study chemistry. I wanted to be a scientist, and typing. Little did we know how valuable that would be. But another thing happened. All of a sudden, I was surrounded by hundreds of kids, including some I knew from the neighborhood. It was like the world was in color. I told Mom I wanted to go to Glenview Junior High. It was a much-needed fresh start. With the fresh start, all geek stuff got washed away. I joined the Boy Scouts and went to camp. I got into the best class, and many of the people in that class remain friends to this day. Dave Lawton, Judy Ike, Shannon Clements, and Linda Christensen, until her passing. I went to Glenbrook South High School in the fall of 1969, as Abbey Road was being released, and started a band with Mike Wyrick, Scott Selby, Paul Lang, and Doug Matthews. While I was probably the most incompetent person ever to play and sing in a band, we got enough gigs that it was a fun experience, and writing songs was one of the first publicly creative things I ever did. For reasons that are difficult to understand, English teachers and writing teachers tended to hate me, and other than being in a couple of plays and getting good results in film class, I in no way distinguished myself. My grades were terrible, mostly my initials, until I got scared and turned it around senior year and slithered into UC Berkeley on the strength of my SAT scores. I'd also been accepted at USC and would eventually go to grad school there. But in the spring of 1973, Berkeley just sounded cooler, so I went and majored in ancient history and classical rhetoric. After a depressing first year in an all-male dorm, I joined a frat and eventually became pledge trainer and president. Life doesn't get better than those years. Setting: the 80s and the monoverse. Let's stop for a moment to talk about the 80s and the monoverse. I learned that term at WeirdCon 2016 in the Mediascape during a Q&A session. I'm not sure where it came from, but I like it. The monoverse is a way of describing the shared reality of the media universe before VCR and cable, when most of the country had 3 networks, a local station, a PBS station, and maybe some UHF stations. That's if you were lucky and lived near a major market. Most cities had 2 papers. Every week, Time and Newsweek came out with a summary of what was happening in the world, and the television news ran at 6 and 11, with local right before or right after. VCRs didn't infiltrate homes in a significant way until the late 70s or early 80s, and if you missed a show, you missed it until reruns aired in the summer. I waited decades to see the end of the Man from U.N.C.L.E. episode Alexander the Greater Affair, in which Ilya was about to be cut in half with a pendulum and Napoleon Solo was over a pit. Then there were Life and Look, magazines that served as a window to the rest of the world through photojournalism at its best. This was an age where a single image encapsulated an event or an era. The girl hovering over the dead body at Kent State, the girl running down the street with napalm on her, the ubiquitous shot of Earth from space, the moon landing, the unimaginable decadence and luxury of the Cannes Film Festival, swinging London in a few shots of miniskirts and bell-bottoms, the see-through shirt. It would be impossible to encapsulate that era without Life and Look. Now, everybody has a video camera, and everybody looks at 50 images a day on a slow day, and it is hard for any shot to make an impact. We have more, but less of it sticks. Back then, a single image, almost always without some pompous quote attached to it, telling you what to think about it, could steer an entire civilization. Mario Cuomo, legendary governor of New York, said something fascinating about his generation, the greatest generation, that I suspect is even more true now. We knew less then, but we understood more. Politically, all 3 networks lived in the same universe. There might have been nuances of difference as to what they thought was and was not important, and there was some carefully calculated bias. But by and large, we perceived whatever Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley was saying as pure, unadulterated truth. The daily papers all seemed to share similar facts and opinions, and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?